the director of the Space Policy Institute and the director of the International Institute for Science and Technology Policy, who's going to give some opening remarks, and then we'll hop into the panel. Scott?
Sure. Okay. Welcome everyone for coming out, and I'm happy that the weather broke a little bit. They're sort of trudging to a lecture in the rain. Why would one do that? But one would do that for this. And quick save, right? This is a great panel. And I'm really happy for Aaron sort of organizing this one. I'll let him, of course, do the introductions of the individuals. But so we're a Space Policy Institute, but we're also part of the larger International Science Technology Policy Program. And there's probably no, greater issue going around than, of course, future of S&T policy, but of course the role of China. There's not much that people agree upon in kind of a polarized Washington, except that, space is good and China's a problem. And the role of this is not just uniquely suited to space, but is part of the larger S&T enterprise that China represents in a number of emerging technologies. China is kind of a trope to say that China is a big place. There isn't some single master plan, maybe as much as everyone might wish there would be. There's a lot of different Chinas. There's things going on, of course, from Beijing. There's going on in regional provinces. There are things going on in cities. There's an intensely, almost say capitalistic environment, competition, but more so that drives behavior in China. There's, of course, the issue of what's the relationship of China's economic growth to its military power and to its diplomatic standings. So I think some of our panelists will hopefully touch on the whole civil-military fusion issue. And some of the ways that China is like us in terms of being interested in innovation and pushing important new technology, contributing to innovation, and other ways where China has some of its own problems and limitations. And I think Jeff Ding especially can talk about that one should take China seriously in emerging technologies. They're not 10 feet tall either, and they have their own areas of vulnerability. The question that I hope we'll get to in the discussion is, well, so what? What do we do about that? I have certain libertarian economist friends who are in favor of free trade with everybody. They were in favor of free trade with the Soviet Union, but they don't think that way about China. And China is different. But how it's different, why it's different, what we should do differently with respect to them relative to maybe other policies, of course, is one of the big questions of the day. So with that, I turn it over to Aaron.
Thanks, Scott. All right, so I'm going to introduce the panelists. Everyone's going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll jump to moderated Q&A. So it's my real pleasure to introduce three very distinguished, internationally recognized experts on China and emerging technology: Dr. Fiona Cunningham from the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Jeff Ding from here at GW, and Dr. Lincoln Hines from Georgia Tech. So Fiona, we'll start with you.
Hey. Super. Can everyone hear me okay? My microphone's up. Super. All right. So thank you very much to both Aaron and Scott, to the Space Policy Institute, for having me here today. It's really magnificent to be back at GW. So many analysts, I think, interpreted remarks that Xi Jinping made, and of course we have to begin any panel that talks about China in any capacity with some remarks from Xi Jinping. But he remarked in his 20th Party Congress work report in late 2022 that China would establish a strong system of strategic deterrence. And I think I begin with this because many analysts, I think, looked at this comment and they thought this is a kind of official acknowledgement of China's plans to build up its nuclear forces. But I think in interpreting that comment in that particular way, a lot of analysts missed an important feature of China's strategic deterrent, which is that it relies very heavily on emerging technology. And so that's my window into looking at China's pursuit and prioritization of emerging technology for military advantage, and the fact that it is not a recent phenomenon, but rather has been a long-standing element of China's kind of approach to emerging technology, and in particular is not just an artifact of China's more recent sort of moves to eclipse and at least catch up with US conventional military power within the Indo-Pacific, but has also been a strategy through which China has attempted to plug gaps and weaknesses in its broader military strategy going back decades. China's strategic deterrence system, including its emerging technology elements, is now at a crossroads, as some of the technologies that it has initially pursued about 3 decades ago are no longer so emerging, and it can no longer necessarily benefit from watching what other countries were doing and acting as a second mover state in thinking about the military applications of emerging technology today. So I'm going to spend the rest of my 10 minutes talking about 3 information age technologies that China pursued for strategic deterrence around 3 decades ago. Its pursuit of offensive cyber capabilities, of counter space capabilities, and of increasingly accurate conventional missiles, all of which China pursued for both coercion as well as for enhancing conventional military operations. So the first of those technologies China pursued for strategic deterrence was its conventional missile force. While it took until about the 1995-96 Taiwan Straits crisis for China's leaders to recognize the promise and the coercive potential of its conventional missile force, the PLA actually had the capability to use conventional missiles for China's leaders to experiment with during that crisis. They launched a number of missiles into the East China Sea near Taiwan during that crisis in both July of 1995 as well as March of 1996. But the reason that China's leaders had those capabilities sort of at hand to experiment with in the crisis is sort of for 2 somewhat unlikely factors. The first is that in the 1980s, China's leaders decided the country was no longer facing a really serious military threat, and its defense industry was going to have to make money in other ways and to sustain its research activities, and that was through foreign military sales. And its defense institutes that had been producing conventional or producing missiles thought it would be a terrific idea to try and export some of those conventional missiles to the Middle East. And that set of exports was actually then blocked because of US pressure. But a rather enterprising missile force at the time that only had nuclear missiles, China's Second Artillery, was also at that time worrying about the fact that it was going to be irrelevant in a future conflict over Taiwan that was expected to only be a local war in which nuclear weapons wouldn't be used, and they would essentially be irrelevant in that conflict if they didn't find something to do. And so what they did is looked at that conventional missiles, sitting there that had been blocked for export and saw them as their ticket to relevance in a future conflict. So there is some contingency in how China's emerging technology investments sort of emerged. The Taiwan crisis then served as something of a watershed because it confirmed that China's leaders were going to need a way to cope with the dilemma of using military force while faced with a nuclear-armed adversary, the United States, that was likely to intervene on behalf of Taiwan, and it needed ways to use military force without leading to a nuclear catastrophe. So conventional missiles offered one way in which China might be able to gain leverage without going nuclear. And following that conflict, its leaders invested extensively in a much larger conventional missile force, also one that was much more accurate and one that was going to be able to bring US bases in the region into range. Over time, over the sort of 2.5 decades that followed, China's missile arsenal has gradually become more advanced with technological and organizational milestones that included things like its anti-ship ballistic missile that emerged in the early sort of 2010s, the more accurate dual-use intermediate range DF-26 missile, which has a hot swappable warhead that can be changed from anti-ship to conventional strike to nuclear. And finally, the DF-17, which is a short-range ballistic missile armed with a hypersonic glide vehicle that China began to test in 2014 and fielded in 2019. So the second emerging technology that China looked to gain leverage and invest in for strategic deterrence was its offensive cyber capabilities. Again, though, China was a second mover in this capability. It had observed US interest in offensive cyber capabilities following the Gulf War. It had looked at some of the Russian concepts of integrated cyber and electronic warfare in the mid-1990s and dabbled with actual capabilities of its own. in the late 90s. But the real impetus for China to invest in offensive cyber capabilities that it could use to coerce the United States was the bombing of its embassy in Belgrade in 1999 during the Kosovo Air War. China's leaders saw that bombing as intentional rather than accidental, and a sign that conflict with the United States could come at any time, including in the decade to follow when China's conventional military modernization was still very much a work in progress. China's cyber attack capabilities aimed at trying to disrupt strategic military as well as critical infrastructure networks in the United States. And after its first offensive cyber units were stood up in the early 2000s, they also evolved significantly. Because the domain of cyber operations itself evolved significantly, but also because China itself became much more dependent on computer networks, which then prompted its leaders to actually intervene in how China's cyber forces were organized as well as operated to try and reel in the freewheeling PLA operators who had been engaged in fairly extensive cyber espionage for profit as well as for national security purposes. A third information age technology that China invested in for strategic deterrence was to field counter space weapons. And I think we're going to come back to this topic, particularly with Dr. Hines, so I won't say too much here. But needless to say, its dramatic test of a kinetic anti-satellite capability in early 2007 overshadowed the fact that China had actually been dabbling in counter space capabilities since the 1960s. And finally made the decision to pursue a coercive capability between 2000 and 2002. But unlike its cyber and missile capabilities, China had always planned to use its capabilities, its counter space capabilities, to threaten escalation in a much more calibrated and managed way, even before it had the capabilities as well as the organizational structures to do so. But in the 2010s, it became even more obvious that China was thinking about limited uses of counter space capabilities as it invested increasingly in non-kinetic and co-orbital capabilities. Its doctrinal writings have also increasingly emphasized concern about the risks of uncontrolled escalation in space. So a couple of kind of key takeaways here. I think it's critically important to grasp about China's pursuit of these three capabilities is the fact that China didn't just pursue them because the US had them or because they could enhance conventional military capabilities, but rather it pursued them and deliberately postured them as a way of threatening escalation in a conventional conflict. And in doing so, it created a kind of different theory of victory that I call strategic substitution, for limited wars fought under the nuclear shadow. And I call it substitution because it substituted for a theory of victory that could be based on threats of coercive nuclear escalation, which China's leaders didn't think was credible at the time, and a theory of victory based on decisive conventional military victories, which China's general purpose conventional forces simply couldn't support at that point in time. So when thinking through the implications of China's investments, I draw out two things about the way that China has looked at these emerging technologies for strategic deterrence. The first is the question of why China picked these capabilities. We can look at some general features of them that suggest they have promise as coercive tools. They have large, or at least promise to have large-scale damaging effects. They cross what we might call salient thresholds in limited wars, like expanding the geographical scope of a conflict or taking it to hit an adversary's homeland. They also have the ability to manipulate the risk of nuclear war because each of them share technology with nuclear operations. But these kinds of capabilities also have other military applications that make them attractive to China, enhancing conventional operations, as well as in the case of counter space weapons, helping to protect China's nuclear weapons from the prying eyes of US satellites. But if there had also been some hype, if not actual demonstrations of their coercive potential in the actions of the United States and other kind of leading powers that were first movers in these technologies. But there was also some contingency in China's choices. It was gambling on capabilities that its top leaders knew they would be able to control the usage of them from within China's territory, which made them more appealing than something like a large conventional bomber force. And it also had existing technological capabilities on which to build for each. The second thing I would just draw out, and I know I'm probably running out time, is how China's bets on these capabilities have played out. So where are we at this point in time? Once emerging capabilities have emerged, I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say their luster as a silver bullet can kind of wear off fairly fast. And these three pillars of China's strategic deterrence capabilities are, I think, proving to be an imperfect solution. China's missiles and counter space capabilities have provoked countermeasures from the United States that could render whatever leverage they gave China a fleeting advantage at best. And meanwhile, I think gaps in how the US and China understand the strategic implications of cyber operations means the US may see China's offensive cyber operations as being a manageable threat below the threshold of armed conflict rather than a true kind of strategic weapon. So where will China then turn in the future? I'd note that its conventional and nuclear modernization provide options it simply didn't have in the past for thinking about how it might adopt these more traditional theories of victory in limited wars. But if it searches for coercive leverage in the future, continue to look to emerging technologies and their promise, things like perhaps unmanned systems, or as Dr. Ding might point out on the AI front, it's no longer going to have the benefit of being a second mover to guide its choices. And therefore, I think it's worth watching where China will go.
All right, thanks, Fiona. And I'll just add that if you want to hear more about her theory of strategic substitution, you should buy her forthcoming book with Princeton University Press. All right, Jeff, over to you.
Title to be determined.
Title to be determined, unlike Jeff's forthcoming.
There's a dispute on that front. No, it's really fun to be here. Really excited to talk to you all. I'm going to keep my remarks brief in part because I want to hear from Fiona and Lincoln more, and I'm just around here like 5 minutes away, so you can always come hear from me. But I'm really enjoying the conversation so far, and looking forward to learn from the other panelists and also from the audience. We're supposed to start with remarks from Xi Jinping, right? So I'm going to continue.
I took that burden off the rest of us, so none of you have to do that.
So my starting point is actually a speech that Xi gave in 2018 to a summit of BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the theme of this summit in 2018 is sustainable development in the fourth industrial revolution. And so Xi gives a speech in front of all the BRICS leaders and attendees to the summit, and he says, new technologies and industrial revolutions have the potential to change the development trajectory of human history. When different Chinese commentators and Communist Party journals go back and try to analyze all these different speeches, because Xi gives a speech and then you have all the analysis that follows, they go back and see that Xi had identified these three past industrial revolutions and then talked about new technologies like AI and the fourth industrial revolution. And what came out of a lot of these analyses was this vision of new industrial revolutions having the potential to shift productivity leadership, right? So Fiona talked a little bit about deterrence, military power. I'm going to be focusing on who has economic leadership and economic power transitions. And the three historical industrial revolutions that he references are first industrial revolution, right? Britain becomes the economic leader first, and then the military and geopolitical hegemon on the back of innovations like the steam engine, innovations in cotton textiles. Second industrial revolution, think 1870 to 1913 period, electricity, chemicals. Oftentimes we think that Germany became a key economic leader, overtaking Britain as the main industrial power off the back of those innovations in the second industrial revolution. Third industrial revolution, US-Japan competition, and what's often called the information revolution. There, everyone thought Japan was going to be the #1 power, right? People wrote books on this, became famous off of this. 20 years later, no one's really talking about Japan as a scientific and technological superpower, in part because the US was able to take advantage of the key technologies that emerged in that third industrial revolution, like computers. So what comes next with AI and what people are calling the fourth industrial revolution? How will that shape the balance of economic power between the US and China? That's what some of my work is mostly focused on. I think the conventional wisdom focuses on which country monopolizes innovation in these new technologies. So who is the first to pioneer that new to the world invention? Which country is the first to debut ChatGPT, right? And that points to a range of institutional factors, policies that are best suited towards monopolizing new to the world innovation. So if you're the Biden administration, you might focus on technology and industrial policy toolkit that is oriented around preventing technological leakage. We can't let someone else steal those first secrets. We need to make sure that we are the first to come up with new innovations. We might implement export controls to prevent another country from becoming the first to innovate. In my work, in my research, I argue that there's a different model for how technological revolutions shape the rise and fall of economic leadership. And drawing from some of these historical examples, I point out that the key technologies in all these industrial revolutions are general purpose technologies. So we've talked about technologies like counter space capabilities, missiles. There's really just one purpose for those technologies: killing people, right? They're really important technologies, but they have narrow ends. Maybe they can be applied as like a movie prop, sort of like a war movie as well, right? But you're not modifying that technology at all. With something like artificial intelligence or electricity, there's a wide range of purposes. There can be pervasive applications throughout the entire economy. And they have to be modified, right? When you have a machine learning model, you have a general model. If you want to apply it to customer service versus computer vision for autonomous driving, that has to be modified substantially, but all of those are captured in the impact of AI. So for general purpose technologies, I argue that the pathway is more about which country can adapt these general purpose technologies at scale, not which country is the first to bring the new innovation to light. So my work argues that if you look at this GPT, general purpose technology model, it's less about controlling the best and brightest talent, making sure that you are the only country that can develop these new technologies. And it's more about how do you connect the people who are on the innovation side with the people who are adapting and implementing technologies in small and medium businesses. Are we only tracking who are the top companies in China at innovating and doing R&D spending, who are the top 3 universities, or are we tracking how strong are the linkages between those top universities and industry? How strong are the communication channels? Are innovations being spread? How deep, how wide is your engineering talent pool in terms of having average AI engineers to adapt some of those innovations? So that's the argument in a nutshell. If we're thinking about how this current industrial revolution, as some people have called it, the 4th industrial revolution, will affect the rise and fall of great powers, understanding where the US and China sit and understanding the best strategies will rely on taking this concept of general purpose technology seriously and this concept of diffusion seriously. That's not just about who initially comes out with that new to the world breakthrough, but about tracing how these general purpose technologies diffuse and permeate throughout the entire economy. And that can be a 4 to 5 decade process, right? So electricity, the first practical electric dynamo comes out around 1870. The US experiences a productivity wave, productivity growth wave off the back of that breakthrough, not until after the 1920s. So taking that seriously means it might not necessarily be about what's happening today, but how are we setting up the US science and technology ecosystem for decades down the line? So yeah, looking forward to your questions and the continued discussion.
All right, thanks, Jeff. And I'll also make a plug for Jeff's book, which is coming out in June, also with Princeton University. Lincoln?
All right, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much to Aaron, to Scott, and the Space Policy Institute here at the Elliott School for the opportunity to speak with you today. Again, this is a really great panel to be on. I'm personally a fan of the work of the other panelists, so it's really great to have this opportunity to get to hear more about their work. So today, I'm going to talk about some of the pressures and motives shaping China's pursuit of space capabilities, as well as some recent trends and what they might mean for international security. So today, China's space program is increasingly in the news. We all know about these recent feats. China landed on the far side of the moon in 2019, becoming the first country to do so, conducted a soft landing on Mars in 2021, second country to do so, and completed its space station in 2022. The plans to expand on it. Now with only 2 space stations in orbit. And there's discussions about the longevity of the International Space Station. Um, Moreover, China's announced plans for a lunar research station that will involve taikonauts, China's equivalent of astronauts. Analysts and policymakers similarly highlight that China is expanding its vast array of counter space weapons, as well as starting to incorporate space capabilities into its own military plans. So today, um, I'm going to talk about some of these motives that are driving China's space ambitions. And China, like most other spacefaring actors, is driven by a variety of motives. These include security motives, economic motives, and concerns about international prestige. But the focus I'm going to talk about today is Chinese beliefs about the role of space and technologies for its development, security, and prestige. Now, again, it's interesting. We see different themes coming up from the other panelists. You hear the expression about space capabilities being a silver bullet, looking at industrial revolutions. And again, this highlights, again, this concept about what beliefs tell us about technology. When we talk about emerging technologies, we are talking about things that are at the frontier of knowledge, and we may not fully understand their payoff or their utility. So it's important to ask where beliefs about technology come from. In addition, I'm going to be talking about another important trend, and that's the role of increasing symmetry between China and the United States in the space domain and what that might mean for China's strategic calculus. So again, China in many ways is not like other countries in its concerns over its interest in space. But it is worth emphasizing the importance of these broader nationalist narratives in driving China and how it understands and approaches new and emerging technologies. From the self-strengthening movement that arose toward the end of the Qing dynasty to the rise of the May 4th movement and the Chinese Communist Party, we can see that the Chinese nationalists have viewed science and technology as central to national survival and salvation. Since the outset of China's space program, China has sought to match the capabilities of the United States and other leading space powers, even when doing so was not necessarily in its broader material interest. There's a very interesting story about China's very first satellite program, which China became interested in the late 1950s and wanted to pursue it by 1959. Mao's justification was in part that it needed to be bigger than the chicken egg of the Americans. So again, this was more on this logic about how we compare to a relative peer group. And in that case, it's the other leading great powers at the time. So it's this belief about where China was and how to get to this kind of former historic position. Okay, so this emphasis on technology as a key to national salvation has often led China to invest in these very costly and difficult capabilities, from human spaceflight to lunar and deep space exploration. And these allow China to signal that it belongs in a very exclusive club of great powers. And these are not necessarily the most efficient means to meet China's security needs. Now, of course, China is also simultaneously pursuing this vast array of counter space weapons. But a human spaceflight program, while of course, we have the record from the United States and the Soviet Union of looking into military uses for this, is very inefficient for being able to pursue some of these objectives in the space domain. We have a lot of unmanned alternatives for doing this. Okay, so Chinese leaders have sought to be recognized as being identified with these different accomplishments in the space domain. You see Chinese leaders wanting to identify themselves with the vast, these big high-profile accomplishments because they see it as a domestic political resource to demonstrate competence about the party and its ability to achieve this kind of rejuvenation, and because it signals that China belongs to this exclusive club of powers. And you see in domestic propaganda how heavily the space program is promoted to the public. So in the post-Tiananmen era, scholars have noted that the Chinese Communist Party is increasingly emphasizing nationalism as a source of domestic legitimacy. And, the state, going back to the patriotic education campaign, has heavily promoted this idea of the century of humiliation narrative. As China's economy begins to cool, perhaps we are going to see that nationalism may continue to be increasingly more important. And I'm certainly not the first to argue this. In this context, space capabilities may provide a particularly powerful symbol for legitimizing for legitimizing the regime's competence and its nationalist credentials. In terms of military space capabilities, it is also important to note some of the role that technology is viewed as providing this answer and this cure for China's ills and its strategic position. And it's also important to note that a lot of this strategy has been driven primarily by this asymmetry between China and the United States. After witnessing the United States' success in the Gulf War, People's Liberation Army analysts called for China to begin winning local wars under informationized conditions. Similarly, Chinese military officials allege that the United States cut off Chinese access to GPS during the 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis. And again, as Dr. Cunningham brought up, a lot of the incentives for China to expand its counter space program happened after the US accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And again, this was viewed as very humiliating and wasn't seen as intentional by the United States. So under Jiang Zemin's leadership, China seeks to pursue these assassin's mace weapons, which have this almost mythological ability for a weaker power to defeat a stronger power. And PLA analysts recognize that space capabilities are the so-called Achilles heel of the US military. Since this time, the most notable example was China's 2007 direct descent kinetic ASAT test. But this is not the only type of counter space weapon China has been developing. Now, of course, many of these technologies are dual use capabilities. They have co-orbital capabilities which could potentially be used for weapons. So it's not explicitly a counter space weapon, but these capabilities certainly can be applied for those purposes. And this provides China important advantages in the event of a localized conflict in its near periphery. And also as a form of coercive signaling, as Dr. Cunningham brings up, to potentially deter the United States and make it think twice about intervening in the event of a conflict in China's near periphery. Now that again is important because it's premised on the strategy of China's position relative to the United States as being in this relative asymmetric position. Does this calculus start to change as China starts to become more of a user of space capabilities and stands to lose more from being denied access to these services? We can see now, for example, with Russia's anti-satellite test 2 years ago, some of this debris came in within close proximity to China's space station, something China had been working on for 3 decades. So there are increasing costs. Again, it's still driven by geopolitical logic on Earth and what China's interest would be in the event of a conflict with Taiwan. So here's a few different policy challenges to think about that arise from China's development as a space power. So one of the questions is, how do traditional concepts like deterrence travel to the space domain, and how viable are they for securing American interest? A challenge that policymakers confront in the space domain is that the US relies more heavily on space assets than other countries. So how do you credibly threaten to retaliate against capabilities that you rely so heavily on? Now, perhaps this will change as China starts to become more reliant. There are also discussions about the use of cross-domain deterrence. But again, this is very difficult to do. How do you threaten to credibly retaliate in another domain? Also, in the space domain, how do you call out nefarious behavior when we don't have clear norms and rules about how to operate in the space domain? Perhaps one of the more fruitful paths forward is for the United States to rely on a deterrence by denial strategy and invest more heavily in these resilient satellite architectures. As we've seen, case in point is the use of Starlink in Ukraine. It creates new targeting challenges and creates a more resilient system that makes it very difficult to negate some of these space-based advantages. Yet these constellations also incentivize developing capabilities to take them out. And so it's a continual reaction, counter-reaction effect from developing these capabilities. There's also recently a piece in the South China Morning Post that was looking at a recent argument from a Chinese PLA analyst who was saying that China needs the capabilities to knock out these mega constellations, which perhaps is unsurprising. It's something that will challenge China's ability to have an effective counter space program. Okay, another problem is how do we avoid misperception and accidental miscalculation? We often say the space domain is congested, contested, and competitive, as there's been a proliferation of space debris and a growth of space actors. And we also know that space capabilities, like many capabilities, are dual use. So this creates enormous challenges and risk for having misperception and accidents. And this is only going to become more complicated when we have mega constellations. When you have Starlink planning to have, around 40,000 satellites in outer space, what does this mean for the sustainability of the space domain, and how does that risk the potential of having an accidental conflict in outer space, especially when you add private actors? And how do you know whether their actions are being pursued by a private entity or if they're being directed by a state-led actor? Again, in the Chinese context, this is even further complicated by the role of bureaucratic politics. Oftentimes, scholars describe Chinese politics as a form of fragmented authoritarianism. And perhaps China's space program is shielded from some of the more extreme challenges that arise from China's fragmented political system. But again, how is information conveyed and how is it communicated? There's evidence from China's 2007 anti-satellite test that, for example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was unaware about the launch of the anti-satellite test. We recently saw the incident of what seemed to be a poorly calculated maneuver to have a spy balloon fly over the United States. So what type of information, and there's work by Tyler Jost focusing on this, but what type of information is being fed to the central leadership? And again, when we look further out to other domains and we start talking about, for example, cislunar space and these new governance challenges that might arise in the space domain, how do we find a way to manage and govern these challenges when the two leading space powers, the United States and China, have very limited interaction with one another? Can we have a robust system of norms and rules without the buy-in of one of the largest space powers? So there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm looking forward to discussing further in the Q&A.
All right, thanks, Lincoln. So as the audience is thinking about questions, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative here and ask you all a question that I'm frequently asked, and that is, does the Cold War heuristic do more harm than good when thinking about the role of technology in U.S. PRC competition? There's oftentimes a lot of analogies made back to the Cold War, U.S.-Soviet competition, and high technology. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts, all three of you, on what these lessons from the Cold War mean for today. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I guess I'm in first with this one. So I think I would attack this in a couple of ways. I think that there are sometimes some overly stylized narratives about the nature of the Cold War, especially in the interaction between technology and strategic deterrence, that probably obscure what the real lessons of the Cold War are. And so one example I would take from this is looking at the Russia-China relationship, right? Like if we look at that as a heuristic from the Cold War to understand the Russia-China relationship today, we're going to have very different planning assumptions about the possibility of Russia-China coordination or quick sequential involvement in conflict with the United States than we might see in some of the planning documents that the administration is putting out right now. So that is, I think, one helpful area of the Cold War that is sometimes overlooked in thinking about the US-China competition going forward. But I think there are a couple of ways in which the heuristic can obscure some parts of the US-China strategic deterrence relationship and get us to be a little bit too kind of tunnel visioned. I think one of those areas is that, if you start to build in more mature information technologies into a strategic deterrence architecture the way China has in having a greater role for offensive cyber, for counterspace, and for its conventional missile force, then you have a much more complicated picture for arms control. You have a much more complicated picture for how you think about strategic stability in the relationship between the US and China than you perhaps did between the US and Soviet Union during the Cold War, when you certainly had some of these technologies, but they were not mature as kind of standalone forms of coercive leverage that they might be today. And I think for me, two sort of things matter here. One is, how much or how little of those emerging technologies do you bring into a conversation about nuclear matters? Should you be talking about certain types of counter space? Should you be talking about certain types of cyber operations, for example? And then the complications that come with where you draw the line between operational uses of these capabilities and those that have very escalatory strategic effects. That is quite fuzzy. And then you also have an organizational component to that of who do you actually bring into the room if you want to have a conversation about arms control and strategic stability, and how do you get services or military organizations like the Strategic Support Force and on the US side in Space Command and Cyber Command sort of into those conversations when their focus may not be on thinking about restraint and strategic stability, but rather about how you really use these technologies to do a better job of fighting wars. So that's one of the areas where I think, stepping away from the Cold War analogy is helpful, and it can do more harm than good in obscuring the nature of the problem.
Jeff?
Yeah, I agree that the Cold War analogy can do a lot of harm. I think especially in the economic competition realm. So the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the Cold War, it was really two separate economic blocks. There was really not a lot of interconnections or interdependence. A very different landscape today with the US and China. I'll just give one example from the AI space. Microsoft's second most important lab, second only to its headquarters in Redmond, Washington, is located in Beijing, Microsoft Research Asia. It's been the wellspring of a lot of different innovations, including breakthroughs in Chinese to English text translation. It created one of Microsoft's most successful chatbots. It's helped Microsoft's technology. It was the birthplace of this article on residual networks that was like the most fundamental paper in terms of allowing us to layer neural networks together for this whole deep learning paradigm. If you go on Google Scholar statistics, that paper is the most cited paper in like the last decade out of any field. All four co-authors are from this Microsoft Research Asia hub. So this is a US technology company, but most of the employees are based in China. A lot of the people who work at this lab will then go and start startups in China. Technology, information, ideas, talent flows in both directions. So it's a very different type of economic system, landscape of economic competition. I think there are a lot more interdependencies between the two ecosystems. But ultimately, I've kind of mellowed on this in terms of there's a saying about historical analogies. Some social scientists, or May, I think, wrote this book about how to use historical analogies. And it's kind of like teenage sex. You can't stop people from doing it, but you can teach them how to do it in safer ways. So like, how do we do this in a safer way? If people are going to make these analogies, I think my main thing is we need a diversity of historical analogies. So my worry is that everybody here in the city operates under a single story and has like this single framework of how to view US-China technological competition and the Cold War mindset. Obviously, there are like ideological concerns, and we can get into that. And so there's stuff to bring in from the Cold War. It's not all imperfect and unapplicable. But I think we need a diversity of analogies. So I like to draw on US-Japan competition in the 1980s, right? I think there's a lot of parallels to that, at least when we're talking about economic competition, who's ahead in leading technologies. So yeah, imperfect, but it's inevitable, and we can do it better.
Lincoln?
I don't know how I can top that analogy, but I will say I'll speak a little bit more specifically on the space domain and thinking about some of these analogies. And a related analogy that's used is the idea of a US-China space race. The space race, the Cold War, can't stop people from using these, but I think they do more to obscure than to illuminate the challenges that are being faced. So for example, the Cold War was this ideological contest to spread different views and norms about the proper system that should work and that should be replicated. How much can the Chinese model be transplanted to other countries? Some scholars have argued that it's a more narrow version of international order that China has, and that's something that's more of building a world safe for autocracy, but a world where you don't see the types of the push for human rights and democracy and liberal interventionism that you've seen under the stewardship of the United States. But it's not this trying to demonstrate the superiority of your system over another system. There isn't this intense ideological component. It's very different. Also, both the powers trade together very extensively. One thing that is actually perhaps more insidious is that the salience of competition with the United States and China is not where it was with the United States and the Soviet Union. And because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, perhaps there was a greater concern about accidents happening and having inadvertent escalation. Do we have that same type of broad level understanding of the potential for a potentially catastrophic encounter with China? In addition, in the space domain, the domain is very different than it was before. There are far many more actors. The challenges are more complex than they used to be. And so in many ways, it's even more challenging today. And so how exactly the Cold War model helps us understand this, I don't see it as being very useful. Again, if we take the idea of a space race even, we see that China was pursuing some of these really high profile and ambitious projects decades ago. So the question is, if it's a race, when did the race start? At what point did it happen? And perhaps if we make it an analogy of a race, we can use the idea of a tortoise and a hare. And China has caught up in many different ways, but this didn't happen overnight. This is something that's been decades in the making. And so, yeah, I think that the analogy it's sensationalist, and it often gets it has a lot of currency in social media and gets a lot of clicks, but it does very little for helping us understand the nature of today's competition.
All right, thanks. Well, and I have to say, Scott and I both loathe the space, especially the space arms race analogy. We now know there were multiple layers of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union in space. So I think part of the problem is there's not even really a good understanding of what happened during the Cold War when people are leaning on these misguided Cold War analogies. So with that, I will open it up to the audience for questions.
Thank you so much for, I'll wait for, thank you so much.
Laura Delgado Lopez with CSIS. I want to see if any of you can reflect on China emerging technologies in international relations. So China has been bringing in technology as part of its toolkit to, including economic incentives, infrastructure, all that good stuff when it approaches particularly countries from the global South. So I'm really curious, and promoting the symbolism of it being the leader of the global South, right? So I'm really curious if you can comment on, do you see emerging technologies coming into that space as well, or is that too risky? Are they going to just keep to more conventional and more basic space technology, for example, rather than bringing some of these new areas where you see China trying to become a leader in? Thank you.
So I'm just going to take perhaps a slightly different angle on the question, which is to note that this is a really important aspect of China's diplomacy, especially in the multilateral space, right? So regardless of what kind of technology China might be providing to countries in the global South through various direct assistance programs, it relies quite heavily on those countries mobilizing them towards visions of governance of emerging technologies within the UN space that align with its interests, sometimes, and actually I would say fairly often alongside Russia and in opposition to US and European and East Asian allied-led sort of initiatives. So two examples I would point to here. One is the cyber OEWGs at the United Nations that, only singular OEWG for cyber, but in which China has worked very effectively to try and mobilize other countries behind a vision of cyber sovereignty. I'd point to the work of one of the PhD students at the University of Pennsylvania, Rachel Hulvey, who's been working on how China uses its sort of discourse power and influence to try to do so, and has a particularly receptive audience among the global South. And similarly, I think we recently saw a split in some of the UN processes with regards to space security between an OEWG led by Russia and China, looking at the conditions to achieve the PPWT treaties realization, in contrast to the US and UK kind of led emphasis on norms of responsible behavior. And again, China is sort of thinking about emerging technologies as essentially a vehicle for, driving its influence through the global South in broader international relations, but also bringing those countries on board in that UN context to sort of strengthen its own visions of what is appropriate behavior and visions for security and governance in those areas.
I like how you have to answer every question first. I get to think a little bit more about my response. Yeah, I basically echo everything that Fiona already said. I think there's two things going on in the sort of digital technology and AI space. One is some of the international expansion is just to these developing markets is because the more developed markets are already saturated with Western products. So it's almost just like the companies are doing what they want to achieve profits, and so they pick the more the less competitive markets. So that's one element. And then there is this other element where there are actually strategic initiatives by the government to push emerging tech as part of a package of infrastructure assistance, things like the Digital Silk Road. Or I'll give one specific example from the AI space. Guangzhou provincial government sets up a deal between a Chinese facial recognition company, iFlyTech, and the Zimbabwe government to provide facial recognition services. That got a lot of coverage. There were debates about, can that Chinese facial recognition company take the facial data of Zimbabwe citizens? But that's one where actually the government is stepping in to facilitate that deal. So some more natural and just market driven because these are emerging markets and less saturated, and some driven by strategic initiatives.
All right, and it's being third, I can just say what they said. I agree with that. So I will just say in the space domain, going back earlier, the Great Wall Industry Corporation is kind of the public-facing state-owned entity that was being used to be able to bargain and make deals for expanding China's launch services to countries around the world. So there's a clear economic motive. It's also the provision of space-based services was part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. That said, the Belt and Road Initiative, it appears there's an increasing consensus that it hasn't been quite as effective as perhaps China hoped it would be, and as the United States feared it might be. And so, there's the traditional countries in the global South that China has engaged with, and it's questionable what additional gains it's getting from providing these in terms of these potential soft power benefits. I will also add something that I find very interesting about, just as a recent example, thinking about China's image and the soft power it gets for its space program, and that was when the core module of its space program, of its space station, went into orbit, and there was the rocket falling down to Earth. And it was interesting. This was supposed to be a really proud moment for China to be able to celebrate and demonstrate that it is part of this great power club, and it has its own space station. And what did the public focus on? They focused on the rocket debris coming down to Earth. And so I think that in many ways, China, it cannot separate its different actions with emerging technologies from its broader foreign policy, its broader parts of its strategy. And it's hard for China to make soft power gains with using some of these capabilities when other elements of its foreign policy and its domestic governance undermine it so heavily.
Well, I just want to say thank you for, I really learned a lot from this all-star panel. I'm Gloria, a fellow Cornell PhD student. I'm curious to hear about your thoughts on how China's state business or state society relations impact its approach to emerging technology. I would envision that it's different, varying from the different area that you have specialties on. Maybe, it's versus the, state business relations in the States, or maybe it's within case variation during the Xi, administration versus the decades before. But how, that I might call it unique interactions changed China's approach to whether it's regulating or leading these tech um, development, I guess. Thank you.
Can I pass the buck to somebody else to start with?
We can start over here and then
Let's do
let's
that.
trade it
As
around.
long as I'm never first, I'm good.
All right, you're the next one. All right, so I'll take this question to think about China in the world of commercial space, its commercial space ambitions. So first of all, I think it's really interesting. The commercial space sector in the United States, some of the challenges that you see Chinese space entrepreneurs complaining about are things that you might have heard from Elon Musk and early entrepreneurs in the U.S. Space sector. But that said, the state level support for China's commercial space sector, it very much appears that it views the idea of what we might think of as commercial in the U.S. sense to be a very limited and marginal role in how China approaches these capabilities. And you see there's this diverse array of different types of commercial space companies. A lot of them are spin-offs from state-owned enterprises. A lot of them retain these informal ties to SOEs, but there are a few companies that genuinely use private capital. They may have links to provincial governments instead of the central government. That said, they still play a fairly marginal role in China's overall space ambitions. And it's, currently there isn't a domestic form of legislation to even clearly delineate what some of the rights are that China's commercial space company should have relative to the state. And you still have to get permission to be able to launch on PLA-owned bases. I'll just say an interesting, anecdote. I interviewed for my research one representative from a private Chinese space company, and he was saying how they're laughed at by the SOEs, and they're largely, they're mocked. They don't take them seriously. And I was saying, well, oftentimes in the U.S. we tend to see everything as it's this pawn of the Chinese government, and he was saying, well, the Chinese government also wants everyone to think that we're a pawn because they want to take credit for our successes. And again, this is still a very small part of the sector. So I still see it being driven largely by these SOEs. And they, again, have all these, they have the advantages of being able to throw money at problems, but they aren't necessarily incentivized to be efficient.
Yeah, what's interesting is in the AI space, because most of the AI leaders come from like the internet firms, you don't have the dominant SOEs in the internet sector. Actually, the most important firms are what I would categorize as hybrid firms, in the sense that their main headquarters, key R&D labs, most of their personnel and their main market is in China. But actually, a lot of their financing and even their leadership has significant foreign ties. So basically, every successful internet firm in China has used the variable interest entity model, which is a way where they can get foreign investment into a sensitive sector without violating like Chinese restrictions on that. And you basically set up like a shell company in the Cayman Islands. And so Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent all have significant foreign investment stakes in a lot of like Chinese government documents that classify whether companies are foreign or domestic in terms of like rankings on patent indicators, for example. Alibaba will be #1 in the foreign enterprise category, right? So I think there is, there's something to be said about all Chinese companies. They face like this unique risk where if there's like some sort of pressing national security issue, the government can almost always step in and take control. Like something like Apple standing up to the US government in San Bernardino, that cannot happen. But I think to Lincoln's point, there is variation in like, you know, a company like State Grid or Huawei is not necessarily the same as a company like Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, or even a lot of the promising AI startups in China. Some of them have much closer state affiliations, but some of them, you know, are trying to list on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and get a lot of foreign investment and oftentimes foreign leadership. Doug Fuller has shown this in the semiconductor space, where China initially wanted the SOEs and the state giants to be the successful firms, but the firms that ended up being successful were the hybrid firms that could kind of get the best of both worlds, play in the Chinese market, but have a lot of foreign ties.
So what they said, I get to take advantage as the third respondent this time. So I thought it would be useful to look a little bit at the cyber domain in this area, because I think this is one of those areas in which China has really been regulating rather than leading. And so I mentioned that China starts to stand up this idea of using offensive cyber units after the Belgrade embassy bombing, I think in December of 2000, the first time that Jiang Zemin mentions cyber warfare in one of his speeches to the CMC. And at that point, China has, I think, like roughly speaking, 5%, if not a little bit less, internet penetration rate within the country. And so the way that the PLA was then able to operate in cyberspace was on the assumption that they basically had no vulnerability in that domain, right? And they were looking at a country, the United States, that had significant vulnerability in terms of both the private sector, critical infrastructure, the government, and especially the military and its dependence on networks. And of course, like the PLA and the government China can sort of think a little bit about how the military think about how the government then invests in the use of computer networks and adjust its policies in theory, which it didn't necessarily do so effectively. But the explosion of internet dependence and embrace in the private sector, in the Chinese economy, and in the kind of societal space with the mega apps of WeChat and I'm thinking Zhifubao. What is it in English? Alipay. Thank you. But so those kinds of platforms then end up taking off within China and creating new types of vulnerabilities that the PLA then has to adjust to, with the push of China's leaders basically saying around the 2014 mark, like, look, we are no longer operating in this space as a military in a way that reflects our national interests and reflects in particular our national vulnerabilities in this space. So that's a way in which I think you see the kind of societal and the sort of business side within China creating new challenges for the government to regulate, even if it wants to keep on doing certain things with the military in one way going forward. I think the other thing I would point to in the cyber domain that has sort of influenced the way that China thinks about using these capabilities for national security purposes is the kind of evolving approach to vulnerabilities and to the sourcing of vulnerabilities in software products. So a couple of years ago, the Chinese government basically banned China's private sector and freelancing hackers from participating in bug bounty contests that took place internationally, and also passed regulations a couple of years ago that required software sort of providers and hackers within China to provide information about the vulnerabilities they would find in network products to the Ministry of Information Technology. I'm missing a word there in the ministry title, but anyway, over to the government ministry, rather than publicly disclosing them, as is the general sort of global best practices that if you find a vulnerability in software, you tell the vendor and then you make it public to the cybersecurity community more broadly so they can patch the vulnerability, so they can alert clients. And that kind of biases in favor of defending those networks rather than having, actors who would want to use those for exploitation of some description to have more resources to do so. So China has then sort of found a way to co-opt that growing kind of online community and cybersecurity presence to further its own sort of national goals in that way, has also drawn on some of its SOEs and tech companies for contractors who would be supporting some of the work of the strategic support force as well. The details of that are kind of murky, of exactly what kind of roles they would be playing, but there's a kind of talent pipeline as well there of pulling on the talent that the that the kind of business and societal sectors online are creating as a resource for China, as well as I previously stated, a kind of vulnerability. So there's that kind of, I think, change going on in the cyber domain.
All right, Jane, did you have a question?
Thanks so much. So this is a question primarily for Lincoln, but I expect the other panelists might have thoughts about it as well. You talked about the sort of the risk and risk reduction issues, and I think we've seen the U.S. sort of frame, emerging technologies can potentially create greater uncertainty, which could create risks. My question is that I feel like I have less of an understanding about how China sees risk and the sort of even in the intersection of risk and emerging technology, or even like risk and traditional technologies, particularly in the military space. So I'm curious sort of how would you characterize where China sees risks? How does it see that? How does one reduce risks? And if it's the case that we don't really know, when you look at this question, what kinds of indicators or what kinds of information do you look for as sort of helping inform you about making sort of a determination on where the Chinese see risks that need to be managed cooperatively?
Great. So that's an excellent question. It's also something that I myself want to have a better understanding of. And I don't have a good answer actually for being able to assess that. I am very interested and curious in trying to understand Chinese perceptions of sensitivity to being able to lose these capabilities. I know actually Dr. Cunningham has some great work on looking at Chinese perceptions in the nuclear domain. And so I think it'd be also worth hearing her response on this. But I think that when it comes to looking at the different types of sensitivities surrounding this, China has one indicator you could see is kind of what China's reactions are to debris generating events in the space domain. And China has been placed in somewhat of an awkward position with India having an ASAT test, China not wanting to be as forthcoming with a condemnation of India because China itself has developed these capabilities. Russian space debris coming within close proximity to Chinese assets. So some indicators could be looking at China's response to what seems to be reckless behavior and what can we observe about public criticism. There hasn't appeared to be much. It's trying to map and try to get a sense of the scale of what China's dependence is on these different types of space capabilities. Can also look at Chinese military writings and try to see, whether there's confidence about escalation management, which a colleague over here can speak about. So I'll turn it over.
Okay, I guess that's my cue to weigh in. So Jane, I think there are two areas to me that are really clear in terms of China's assessment of risk, which may not fall into our traditional sort of understanding of interstate risk, but two things to me are extremely clear coming from how China looks at emerging technologies. One is risks for social stability. That's a really clear problem and priority for China in thinking about, what these technologies are going to do, whether it's the effect on, employment opportunities within China that comes from the fourth industrial revolution, or the potential for mobilization from widespread adoption of internet access or internet access technologies. The other is the lack of leadership control. That's another really clear, I think, thread within how the PLA is relationship with central civilian leaders comes forth, that there is a concern of a risk of the leadership basically losing control of operators, that there are some exceptions to this obviously, but in general that is I think a really constant and clear thread of something that China sees as a risk. And if you can imagine a way in which you lose control of operators or you generate social instability, that's a risk that China is going to prioritize dealing with, perhaps even at the expense of thinking about external risk. I think when it comes to assessments of external risk, I'll just say two things: that in my own work, I've really tried to look at a couple of aspects of their postures for using different types of emerging technologies. Are they building kinds of or acquiring technologies or, within those technologies, capabilities that can help them manage risk? Are they looking at attribution capabilities? Are they looking at situational awareness, things that will actually allow you to get the information to manage risks? Are the organizations that operate these technologies set up in ways that allow leaders to see what's going on and to control those risks, to assess them in advance? Do the doctrinal writings mention risk management as being an important part of how they operate the capabilities? Are they being, signaling things about how they plan to use these capabilities, whether privately or publicly, to the United States? That, for example, in 2016, when China released a cybersecurity strategy, it listed a couple of sectors that could be considered critical infrastructure. It wasn't exhaustive, but those are the kinds of baby steps of saying, like, these are what we consider to be kind of strategic targets for cyber operations that would be disruptive, right? So that's a sort of set of metrics that I look for, even if it's not always blindingly obvious how China thinks about whether there are or not risks and its priority on managing them. The final thing, though, that I just emphasize is in my conversations with Chinese experts over some years, what's emerged is a trend that if the overall political relationship between the United States and China is smooth, then managing the kind of details of risks is considered kind of less important, because if the political relationship is smooth, everything at kind of lower levels is more or less going to fall into place. But on the other hand, if the political relationship is not necessarily smooth, then you don't have the conditions that are conducive to actually coming up with those risk management techniques at the detailed level. So for them, it's very much sort of focused on how the political relationship overall colors the likelihood of those risks emerging, and hence also whether the two countries will be able to manage them in a way that avoids broader escalation and damage to the relationship.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add, Jane, is as I was thinking through it, I feel like I could give you an answer if the question is, does China view the safety and security of different emerging technology systems as a priority or not? I think it's harder to answer your question, because your question is, does China view these emerging technologies as posing risks that might escalate beyond just like safety and security issues into like conflict or things like that of that nature? I still think that the first question might give you a hint into, like, I don't know, like China has gotten at least a little bit better at reducing risks with like launches, right, over the past couple decades. How has that come about? What were the signals there? Does that tell us about what they think about the risk of, I don't know, space debris and these contagion effects? So that would be my starting point. Is we have a lot of, if you're concerned about these military risks, so many of these technologies are dual use that you could look at, okay, what are the technical standards they're adopting for building some of the civilian counterparts or the civilian components of these military missions, and see how that's evolved over time.
Hi there, I'm Andrew Farquharson. I work on the Lockheed Martin Government Affairs team. I was wondering if you could speak about the role of international standard settings and regulatory bodies in the broader Chinese strategy. So, for instance, I know the 2020 DoD electromagnetic superiority strategy states explicitly that U.S. adversaries are seeking to undermine DoD's access to the electromagnetic spectrum through these international fora. So are you seeing anything like that in space or elsewhere, or just general trends to that end?
I'll take a stab. So I will say that speaking to kind of China's strategy when it comes to international fora and how we govern activities in the space domain, China has been very notable for advocating the Prevention of the Placement of Weapons of Outer Space Treaty. And the US, and I think correctly so, viewed this as an insincere effort on the Chinese part, viewing it as something that wouldn't restrict China's development of anti-satellite weapons, but perhaps would be something that would restrain the United States. So you see, this is a way it provides kind of a political posturing. It looks very popular normatively, but doesn't really have a strong chance of being passed. Thinking about China's interact in other bodies, China has used international bodies like the United Nations to file complaints about activities of private space companies such as SpaceX, complaining that the Starlink satellites require that China's space station had to do avoidance maneuvers. So we can see that it has been using some of those bodies to do this. There's some work recently by a PhD student at MIT, Thomas Roberts, and he has looked at China's compliance with the ITU, and China has also been fairly compliant with ITU, even while doing. He's come up with a very systematic way of measuring compliance, and he's found that despite doing some very very unusual maneuvers, has still stayed within the kind of the contours of what is supposed to be seen as a fine operating space for the ITU. So with that said, how it comes to how China is using some of these fora strategically, I mean, it is using the United Nations, the instruments available, and it is trying to pass different types of legislation, even if these aren't necessarily going to amount to much.
I couldn't describe what the electromagnetic spectrum was to you, so I'm gonna on that question.
Hi, thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. I believe this question might be more geared toward Dr. Ding's level of work. So I wanted to ask, in the interest of providing insights more than predicting the future, how do you perceive a stagnating population growth and a slowing economy and housing market crisis affecting China's capacity to incorporate emerging technologies into their social, political, and military spheres? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think when we're talking about adoption of general purpose technologies at scale throughout the entire economy, right? You can't just have a few super developed coastal provinces that can create these frontier firms. Then some of these structural issues that you're talking about really do come into play more. We know that just countries with higher levels of GDP were better able to diffuse the internet at scale. So I do think that that all of those factors will. I think a lot of them are pointing to that China will not be as well equipped as other countries to adopt AI at scale throughout the entire economy. The demographics one is interesting though, in that, yeah, the loss of the demographic dividend will affect China's overall economy, but it may push businesses to be more willing to switch to like robotics or implement more automated solutions. So I'd say overall, all those factors you just listed do point in the other direction of China not being as well equipped to adapt to GPTs, but some of those have unique characteristics that could point in the other direction. But it's a great question.
I'll just add one thing very, very quickly, which is to say that I think most analysts of the PLA and China's military budget in particular don't expect that a slowdown in economic growth is going to affect the kind of levels of spending on the military going forward. I would recommend, I think Joel Wuthnow just had a piece come out in the China Leadership Monitor, I think earlier this week, looking at some of these questions of how the economic slowdown will affect continuing investments in the military budget, and obviously within that, the R&D kind of investments the PLA is making too.
Thank you. We have some online questions for the panelists. The first one from Christian G. How has China's approach to offensive cyber changed as AI capabilities have grown across the West? In particular, if you could talk about data poisoning or adversarial examples in use, and to what extent? Thank you.
So I mean, all I can say on this piece is I haven't looked really specifically at this issue of how AI is affecting offensive cyber operations. I mean, China's obviously doing research in this area, but this might be an area that Dr. Ding is a little better positioned to maybe comment on. Or
I will also punt a little bit, but just point Christian to CSET, Center for Security and Emerging Technology, is a great like cyber AI team that's looking into this issue. He's talking about sort of the kind of adversarial attacks, data poisoning as a way to subvert AI systems from functioning as normal. So think like a computer vision system that sees a pixel change on a stop sign and that turning into a green light. But there's also other people working on like how AI can enable more like propaganda generation. So Josh Goldstein, and Stanford Internet Observatory people have been looking into that issue as well. So sorry, just pointing you to other people who know this better.
We have another question online regarding advancements in AI and its diffusion. Could you speak about the role of China's semiconductor policy in this area?
I can take the first stab at that. So I think this is really interesting, right? Because the US's strategy is let's cut off all the high-end chips from China so they can't train cutting-edge models. Now, there's a lot of loopholes to that. It's hard to implement export controls in today's globalized world. But essentially, that's the strategy. If it succeeds, China cannot get any more NVIDIA A100s and the counterparts to train some of these cutting-edge models like GPT-3, ChatGPT, GPT-4, and so on. What I think is interesting is if you take the diffusion model seriously, it's less about who is able to train the best model, and it's more about who can take that model and have all their different businesses, students, entrepreneurs apply that model. So then it's less about the chips to train the model and more about the chips to run the model, chips for inference. And in that category, it's almost impossible to control the outflow of those chips. And so I think for me, it's more about which country is able to come up with chips and spread chips around that make it much easier and less intensive and from a resource perspective to take these models and condense them, fine tune them, compress them to be able to be used for like small scale applications or industry specific applications. And those chips cost much less than NVIDIA A100s. You can't control them with export controls. It requires sort of like a different set of strategies. So chips for training versus chips for inference, innovation, whoever comes up with new to the world innovations versus who can actually diffuse these innovations to make an economic impact, I think are two different pathways.
Lincoln? Good. Sure.
Hi, thank you so much for coming out. This is an excellent discussion. I've been trying to get this in, but it didn't really seem to fit whatever the topic of conversation was. My question is about whether you think there can be parallels drawn between China's activities in the emerging tech space, specifically in cyber and in space, and some of its other foreign policy actions. And I'm thinking specifically about its maritime operations in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and then also territorial or border disputes with India, for instance. Do you see a similar approach in the way China leverages space and cyberspace? And then as a follow-on to that, do you also think the same tools and responses that the US has tried and have been effective in and against China's maritime operations could be tried out here? Thank you.
I'll take this one to start with. I think the immediate parallel that jumps out to me is that if you think of China's actions in a lot of its territorial disputes, it's been very careful, with perhaps the exception. And I mean, even in the Indian border conflict that took place in 2020, which got very ugly, right? There were no shots fired, even though people ended up being killed. But China has been very careful about not tripping over the threshold of armed conflict, right? So a lot of those gray zone operations, the use of administrative coercion, And, you know, I would point you to a recent book that Dr. Kertian Zhang just published called China's Gambit that looks at this calculation very carefully. But one of the key things that China is often trying to do there, in my sort of opinion, that I think looks similar to the emerging tech space, is trying to not trip over the threshold of armed conflict in the way that it uses the gray zone. Similarly, when it thinks about coercion in armed conflict, the idea is to not trip over the nuclear threshold, right? You're trying to squeeze your adversary up to this salient threshold, but make it be the one to take the step over that line. And you're making an assumption that your adversary doesn't want a nuclear war and the capabilities I described, or doesn't want an armed conflict in the kind of territorial disputes and the way it's prosecuted those recently. So that sensitivity to avoiding tripping certain thresholds, but really driving up to those points, the approach to pursuing its capabilities, to me, is the kind of key parallel between China's strategies in the gray zone versus with the emerging technologies, at least militarily. In terms of US approaches, I'll hand it off to my co-panelists, because I'm trying to think about like what's the equivalent of like doing a FONOP when it comes to the coercive leverage uses of counter space and cyber operations. I'm not 100% sure, but I'll hand it over to the others to take a stab at that one if they have the magic bullet on FONOPs in space.
Lincoln? All right, FONOPs in space. I will say that there are a few interesting parallels to thinking about China's activities and other parts of its foreign policy and how it applies to the space domain. One of those, as Dr. Cunningham highlights, is that that role of these operating right below the threshold, these sort of kind of gray zone operations, doing things that don't explicitly challenge what is seen as normal practices. Now, again, in the space domain, there are very loose regulations, so there's quite a lot that you can do in the space domain. In addition, I would say, another act, I was talking about the role of prestige. I think there's a lot of interesting parallels with China's naval modernization and its pursuit of some of these kind of grandiose programs like its human spaceflight program or its lunar program. There's this piece by Robert Ross on China's naval nationalism that came out in 2009, and he was arguing that these often these land powers, it's not really smart to get involved in these blue water naval operations. And some have taken those types of analogies of green water and blue water to talk about how we conceive of the space domain. And right now, the main thrust of activity in space domain is in these traditional orbital regimes of low Earth, medium Earth, and geosynchronous orbit. That said, while we talk about going to further expansive projects like going to the moon or cislunar space, a lot of the strategic value there is still very hypothetical and still very uncertain. But we see the United States, China, and a lot of other countries are investing heavily in trying to pursue initiatives in this area. But I think that perhaps looking at that kind of nationalism, prestige angle provides an important window into understanding some of the thrust there. In terms of FONOPs in space, I've heard this one analogy that was taken to say, there was this kind of hyperbole saying that China is going to take over the moon. And now, of course, there are limited landing spots, perhaps on the South Pole, and there's craters and perhaps limited areas that you can actually do this successfully. And so there's this idea that, I saw there was a think tank report that came out recently, and it was saying that perhaps we'll see, something equivalent to China's maritime militia in space. That to me seems very far out. That seems, the scale that we are talking about, the physical distance to be able to deny access within these areas, that to me seems to stretch the imagination. Of course, we can have counter space operations, but we have to still ask for what purpose. It's to provide something here on Earth, to provide those services here on Earth. And so what do you gain by doing that? Do you have more efficient ways to do that? I would say China probably does. Than getting involved in this kind of far out, cislunar military strategy.
Jeff, do you have anything to add? All right, so we're at time, so I just want to thank all of our panelists one more time. And there's plenty of sandwiches, bagels, and coffee left, so have at it. Thank you.